Welcome to Framework, the podcast that makes the NIST cybersecurity framework practical, engaging, and accessible. Whether you're a cybersecurity professional, business leader, or simply curious about how organizations defend against cyber threats, this series is for you. This podcast is inspired by a comprehensive guide to the NIST Cybersecurity Framework 2.0, a best-selling resource written by cybersecurity expert Dr. Jason Edwards and trusted by professionals worldwide. In each episode, we'll leverage a few insights from Jason's extensive book to dive deep into CSF 2.0, unpacking every function, category, and subcategory with real-world applications you can immediately use. If you're enjoying this episode and want to learn more, head over to cyberauthor.me to grab your copy of the book and access additional resources to enhance your cybersecurity journey. You can also visit baremetalcyber.com, where over 2 million people last year explored expert insights, articles, and practical tools across a wide range of cybersecurity topics. GV.SC-07, Managing Supplier Risk Throughout Relationships. GV.SC-07 ensures that organizations continuously assess, mitigate, and monitor supplier cybersecurity risks throughout the lifecycle of vendor relationships, ensuring that third-party security compliance remains aligned with evolving threats, business operations, and regulatory requirements. This subcategory belongs to the Govern function within the National Institute of Standards and Technology Cybersecurity Framework, version 2.0, emphasizing that supplier cybersecurity risks do not end once a contract is signed. Instead, organizations must proactively manage third-party security risks through ongoing assessments, compliance monitoring, and adaptive risk mitigation strategies. Without structured supplier risk management throughout vendor relationships, organizations risk exposure to undetected security vulnerabilities, weakened supply chain security postures, and regulatory non-compliance due to outdated supplier security controls. By managing supplier risks throughout relationships, organizations ensure that vendor security assessments, compliance verification, and threat monitoring remain continuous, reducing the likelihood of third-party security failures impacting enterprise cybersecurity resilience. A structured approach to supplier risk management allows organizations to identify evolving security threats, enforce real-time supplier security compliance measures, and adjust vendor risk mitigation strategies dynamically. Organizations that implement continuous supplier security risk monitoring, enforce adaptive security compliance controls, and integrate vendor security oversight into enterprise cybersecurity governance improve their ability to detect, prevent, and mitigate third-party security risks proactively. Multiple stakeholders play a role in managing supplier risks throughout relationships. Procurement and vendor management teams are responsible for maintaining supplier risk oversight, ensuring vendor security compliance remains enforced, and addressing supplier security incidents promptly. Cybersecurity and risk management teams conduct ongoing vendor security audits, monitor supplier security performance, and assess third-party security performance and assess third-party security risks dynamically. Legal and compliance officers ensure that supplier risk management aligns with contractual security obligations, industry regulatory frameworks, and evolving cybersecurity compliance requirements, reducing exposure to legal and regulatory security risks. Supplier risk management throughout vendor relationships is implemented through continuous security monitoring frameworks, structured supplier risk reassessment protocols, and adaptive vendor security enforcement mechanisms. This includes conducting periodic third-party security audits, enforcing dynamic supplier cybersecurity compliance measures, and integrating real-time vendor risk monitoring systems into enterprise cybersecurity strategies. Organizations that fail to manage supplier risks continuously risk overlooking emerging third-party security threats, facing vendor compliance violations, and being unprepared for supply chain cyber incidents that evolve over time. Several key terms define supplier risk management throughout relationships and its role in cybersecurity governance. Ongoing supplier risk assessment ensures that organizations regularly evaluate vendor security performance, identifying new vulnerabilities and adjusting security controls accordingly. Continuous vendor security monitoring enables organizations to track third-party security compliance dynamically, ensuring that vendor cybersecurity governance remains proactive. Supplier security performance reviews, ensure that vendors are evaluated periodically based on cybersecurity maturity, threat exposure, and compliance adherence. Adaptive third-party risk mitigation allows organizations to implement evolving cybersecurity enforcement mechanisms, responding to changing vendor security risks dynamically. Regulatory compliance enforcement for vendors mandates that organizations align supplier security risk management with legal and industry cybersecurity mandates, ensuring sustained compliance. Challenges in managing supplier risks throughout relationships often lead to incomplete vendor security oversight, weak enforcement of supplier cybersecurity compliance, and failure to integrate supplier risk management into enterprise security strategies. One common issue is lack of continuous supplier security reassessments, where organizations fail to update vendor risk profiles after onboarding, leading to undetected cybersecurity vulnerabilities in third-party networks. Another issue is over-reliance on initial supplier security assessments, where organizations assume that vendor cybersecurity risks remain static, neglecting the impact of evolving cyber threats. Some organizations mistakenly believe that supplier security enforcement is only necessary at the beginning of the vendor relationship, without recognizing that cybersecurity risks change over time and require continuous management to ensure compliance. When organizations manage supplier risks continuously, they enhance supply chain security transparency, improve vendor security compliance, and ensure that third-party cybersecurity risks are dynamically mitigated. A structured supplier risk management framework ensures that vendor security assessments remain updated, supplier security performance is monitored in real time, and third-party security compliance remains aligned with enterprise cybersecurity governance strategies. Organizations that implement continuous supplier cybersecurity monitoring, enforce periodic vendor security risk reassessments, and integrate third-party risk mitigation into enterprise security governance develop a comprehensive supply chain security strategy that strengthens vendor security resilience and reduces third-party cyber risks proactively. Organizations that fail to manage supplier risks continuously throughout vendor relationships face significant cybersecurity, operational, and compliance risks. Without ongoing oversight, businesses risk engaging with suppliers whose security postures deteriorate over time, leading to increased exposure to third-party data breaches, regulatory penalties, and operational disruptions caused by vendor security incidents. A common issue is assuming that an initial supplier security assessment is sufficient, where organizations fail to conduct follow-up evaluations, leaving them unaware of new security vulnerabilities that emerge after onboarding. Another major challenge is reactive supplier risk management, where organizations only reassess vendor security controls after a security breach, instead of proactively monitoring supplier cybersecurity performance and mitigating risks before incidents occur. By implementing structured supplier risk management throughout relationships, organizations ensure that third-party cybersecurity risks are continuously evaluated, vendor compliance remains enforced, and supply chain security policies remain updated to reflect evolving cybersecurity threats. A well-defined supplier risk management framework helps businesses prevent third-party security failures, maintain regulatory compliance, and ensure that supplier cybersecurity strategies align with corporate cybersecurity objectives. Organizations that establish ongoing supplier security evaluation processes, enforce periodic vendor risk reassessments, and integrate third-party cybersecurity risk monitoring into enterprise security governance strategies improve their ability to detect, prevent, and mitigate supplier cyber threats proactively. At the partial tier, organizations lack formal supplier risk management frameworks, leading to unstructured vendor security monitoring, inconsistent supplier compliance enforcement, and weak alignment between supplier risk governance and enterprise cybersecurity strategies. Supplier security oversight is handled reactively, with organizations only addressing vendor security risks when a cybersecurity incident occurs. A small business at this level may engage with cloud service providers, software vendors, or payment processors without continuously reassessing their cybersecurity risk postures, leaving potential security vulnerabilities unmonitored. At the risk-informed tier, organizations begin to develop structured supplier risk management policies, ensuring that vendor security risks are reassessed at scheduled intervals. However, supplier risk management efforts may still be limited, with inconsistent enforcement of security reassessments across different supplier tiers. A mid-sized financial institution at this level may require high-risk vendors to undergo security reviews annually, but fail to apply the same level of cybersecurity scrutiny to lower-tier suppliers, creating gaps in supply chain risk management. At the repeatable tier, organizations implement a fully structured supplier risk management framework, ensuring that vendor security assessments are standardized, supplier risk evaluations are updated periodically, and third-party security compliance enforcement aligns with enterprise risk management strategies. Supplier security governance is formalized, with leadership actively involved in reviewing supplier security performance and ensuring that ongoing supplier security risk management is embedded into enterprise cybersecurity governance. A healthcare organization at this stage may require all third-party electronic health record service providers, cloud hosting vendors, and medical device manufacturers to complete periodic cybersecurity reassessments, ensuring compliance with evolving regulatory mandates such as the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. At the adaptive tier, organizations employ AI-driven supplier cybersecurity risk intelligence platforms, predictive vendor security compliance tracking tools, and automated third-party risk monitoring solutions to dynamically enforce continuous supplier cybersecurity risk assessments and ensure real-time vendor security compliance verification. Supplier security management is fully integrated into enterprise cybersecurity governance, ensuring that vendor cybersecurity compliance, supplier risk reassessments, and third-party cybersecurity governance remain continuously optimized. A global defense contractor at this level may use AI-powered supplier risk analytics platforms to assess vendor cybersecurity performance, enforce automated security compliance validation, and dynamically adjust supplier cybersecurity risk assessments based on evolving regulatory frameworks. Managing supplier risks throughout relationships aligns with multiple controls in the National Institute of Standards and Technology Special Publication 800-53, ensuring that organizations implement structured supplier cybersecurity risk assessment frameworks and dynamic third-party security compliance enforcement models. One key control is SA-12, Supply Chain Risk Management, which requires organizations to establish formal supplier risk reassessment processes, ensuring that vendor cybersecurity risks are continuously evaluated throughout the duration of business relationships. A global telecommunications company implementing this control may require all third-party infrastructure service providers to undergo periodic cybersecurity risk assessments and ongoing security audits to maintain compliance with industry security regulations. Another key control is CA-7, continuous monitoring, which mandates that organizations establish real-time supplier security monitoring frameworks, ensuring that vendor cybersecurity risks are dynamically assessed and emerging security threats are detected proactively. A financial services institution implementing this control may deploy continuous third-party risk assessment tools to track vendor security compliance in real time, ensuring that supplier security governance remains aligned with evolving cybersecurity risks. Managing supplier risks throughout relationships also aligns with SR-7, third-party security monitoring, which requires organizations to implement continuous supplier cybersecurity monitoring mechanisms, track vendor security compliance dynamically, and enforce third-party risk mitigation measures as security threats evolve. This control ensures that organizations maintain visibility into supplier cybersecurity risks over time, allowing them to detect and respond to third-party security vulnerabilities before they escalate into major incidents. A global cloud services provider implementing this control may establish automated vendor security risk dashboards, AI-driven third-party security analytics, and real-time supplier compliance tracking to ensure vendor security risks are continuously monitored. These controls can be adapted based on organizational size, industry, and cybersecurity maturity. A small business may implement basic supplier risk monitoring procedures, ensuring that vendors handling customer data or IT services undergo periodic security reviews and update compliance certifications annually. A large enterprise may deploy AI-powered third-party cybersecurity risk assessment platforms, automated supplier security compliance tracking solutions, and predictive vendor risk modeling tools to ensure that supply chain security enforcement dynamically evolves based on changing cybersecurity threats and supplier risk profiles. Organizations in highly regulated industries such as finance, healthcare, and government contracting may require continuous supplier security audits, executive-led vendor cybersecurity compliance review meetings, and industry-specific third-party security benchmarking to ensure supplier risk management aligns with legal cybersecurity mandates. Auditors assess supplier risk management throughout relationships by reviewing whether organizations have structured, documented, and continuously enforced supplier risk monitoring frameworks. They evaluate whether organizations implement structured vendor security monitoring models, enforce third-party cybersecurity risk compliance tracking, and integrate supplier risk reassessment processes into enterprise-wide cybersecurity governance strategies. If an organization fails to manage supplier risks throughout vendor relationships, auditors may issue findings highlighting gaps in vendor security risk management, weak supplier cybersecurity compliance enforcement, and failure to align third-party security monitoring with enterprise cybersecurity policy. To verify compliance, auditors seek specific types of evidence: ongoing supplier cybersecurity risk assessment reports and structured vendor security monitoring documentation demonstrate that organizations formally define and enforce structured supplier risk management strategies. Third-party security, compliance tracking records, and supplier cybersecurity audit reports provide insights into whether organizations proactively monitor vendor cybersecurity performance and refine supplier risk policies based on real-time security risk intelligence. Incident response evaluations related to supplier security failures and third-party risk mitigation assessments show whether organizations effectively track vendor cybersecurity risks, ensuring that supplier risk management remains continuously enforced. A compliance success scenario could involve a global manufacturing company that undergoes an audit and provides evidence that supplier cybersecurity risk management is fully integrated into procurement and vendor management workflows, ensuring that vendor security risks are continuously evaluated, third-party cybersecurity compliance frameworks are actively enforced, and supplier risk governance remains aligned with regulatory security standards. Auditors confirm that third-party security risks are systematically managed, vendor cybersecurity compliance is continuously enforced, and supplier risk management aligns with enterprise cybersecurity risk governance strategies. In contrast, an organization that fails to implement structured supplier risk management frameworks, neglects vendor cybersecurity compliance verification, or lacks formalized supplier security governance models may receive audit findings for poor third-party security oversight, weak supplier risk management enforcement, and failure to integrate vendor cybersecurity risk assessments into enterprise security strategies. Organizations face multiple barriers in ensuring that supplier risk management remains continuous throughout vendor relationships. One major challenge is lack of dedicated resources for ongoing supplier cybersecurity monitoring, where organizations fail to allocate personnel, tools, or automated solutions to track third-party security risks dynamically. Another challenge is failure to enforce adaptive supplier security policies, where vendor cybersecurity requirements remain static despite evolving cybersecurity risks and regulatory requirements. A final challenge is over-reliance on supplier self-reporting, where organizations accept vendor security attestations without conducting independent third-party cybersecurity risk assessments, increasing the risk of undiscovered vulnerabilities. Organizations can overcome these barriers by developing structured supplier risk monitoring frameworks, ensuring that vendor cybersecurity compliance remains continuously enforced, and integrating supplier cybersecurity risk assessments into enterprise-wide cybersecurity governance strategies. Investing in automated vendor supplier security compliance tracking tools, predictive supplier security risk assessment platforms, and AI-driven supplier security monitoring solutions ensures that organizations dynamically assess, monitor, and refine supplier risk management strategies in real time. Standardizing supplier cybersecurity governance methodologies across departments, subsidiaries, and external business partners ensures that vendor security policies are consistently applied, reducing exposure to third-party cyber threats and strengthening enterprise-wide supply chain security resilience. By embedding supplier cybersecurity risk management into enterprise cybersecurity governance strategies, organizations enhance vendor security accountability, improve regulatory compliance, and ensure sustainable supplier risk management strategies across evolving cybersecurity landscapes. That wraps up today's discussion on framework. Don't stop here. Head over to cyberauthor.me to explore more cybersecurity topics and discover a best-selling book covering NIST and other critical cyber frameworks. Please like, rate, and review this episode on Apple and Spotify. Until next time, remember that knowledge is power.